Welcome to today's sessions on territory. And my name is Nitin Batla, and I'm the coordinator of the doctoral program at the Institute of Landscape and Urban Studies. So this spring semester at the sessions of territory, we are addressing the notion on agriculture, urbanism, and the countryside. And the lecture program is curated by the Chair of Architecture of Territory at the Department of Architecture here at the ETH Zurich. We have a collaboration with the Institute of Landscape and Urban Studies. The co-curators of this session series of sessions is Professor Milica Topalović, Nasli Tumadem, Hans Hortig, and me. And I would like to thank Ayman Heine, who's helping us with recording this lecture and making it available via Zoom. We're doing this event in a hybrid mode. And a very warm welcome to Tamar Novick, who's joined us from Berlin today, and to our respondents, Hollyamber Kennedy, who's a colleague of ours, and also Will Davis, who's recently arrived from Singapore. So I will introduce them in a moment. I just wanted to say a word about this sessions on territory, and it's a long-running lecture series here at the department. So what concerns us in the program on this sort of sessions on territory is the future of urbanism itself. And a few years ago, this sessions on territory started with a question: if urbanism as a discipline continues to be relevant in the future, in education, in design practice, and in the public sphere, what should be its new characteristics? What should we work towards? And under the term urbanism, we understand a range of interconnected fields which have to do with urban and landscape design, with territorial design, with various forms of spatial practice, including urban activism and the arts, and so on. And we also understand urbanism in its extended form, extended geography, which involves the broadening of perspective beyond the city-centric focus and to the wider territories of extraction, for example, and even to the planet. So brief look at the previous sessions on territory, which has been running since 2017. So each iteration looked at urgent domains of urban and territorial design and practice, research and pedagogy. So there was one sessions on territory, which was on neoliberal power and politics, one on ecologies of the Anthropocene, technology beyond technofixing, politics of material flows and accumulations. And we are now in the 7th iteration of the sessions, where we look at the agriculture, the neglected backside and the antimony of urban and the cities. So the aim of the program is to frame and explore the critical agrarian question emerging in the 21st century extended urbanization. And the themes that we're debating in this current iteration are there alternatives that are being articulated to the global food regimes? Can we deindustrialize agricultural landscapes of the global north and decolonize the plantations of the global south? Can we re-examine the ways in which plants and animals are used in industrial food systems? And can we use technology in agriculture to support biodiversity? We will argue for the relationships of care and reciprocity with soil and biodiversity to help move beyond intensive industrial models towards agroecological and regenerative land practices. So we've invited some of the leading academics and practitioners worldwide who are working at the confluence of urban, agrarian, and landscape studies and design. And some of you attended the introductory lecture by Raj Patel, and a few weeks ago, we also had Lenora Ditzler, who talked about the future of food. So in the continuation of this sort of series of sessions and discussions with our invited guests, we have today the great pleasure of having Tamar Novick with us, Dr. Tamar Novick, who's a senior research scholar at the Max Planck Institute for History of Science in Berlin. She's trained as a historian of science and writes about agriculture, technology, animals, bodily waste, and fertility research in Palestine-Israel. She holds a PhD from the Department of History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. And Tamar is the author of the forthcoming book, Milk and Honey, Technologies of Plenty and the Making of Holy Land, which will be published by MIT Press. It comes out soon. So currently at the Max Planck Institute, she leads a working group on animals and knowledge construction titled Out of Place and Out of Time. Tamar Novick's lecture today, Reproducing Plenty, will explore settler colonialism, agriculture, and fertility science in Palestine-Israel. And our respondents today are Dr. Hollyamber Kennedy, who many of you know already, and she maybe doesn't need an introduction, but I will. And she's an architecture historian and theoretician, and she received a PhD from the Graduate School of Architecture and Planning at the Columbia University. And she currently holds a visiting lectureship at the Institute of History and Theory of Architecture at our Department of Architecture here at the ETH Zurich. She's taught courses on the history of territory, apartheid, modernism, and a course on architecture epistemology after the empire or beyond the empire. Our second respondent today, Dr. Will Davis, who is joining us from Singapore, is also an architecture historian. Will researches on hydropolitics, agribusinesses, and traditional systems of knowledge. And he's currently teaching history and theory of architecture at the Department of Architecture at the National University of Singapore. So I would like to welcome Tamar, and please join me in welcoming Tamar on the stage.
So hi everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. In my talk today, what I'll try to do is characterize the foundation of the settler colonial project in Palestine in the 20th century. I will talk a lot about reproduction, first of all, because I was asked to, but also because what I will try to show is that reproduction management was the backbone of the political project. What I'll try to show is that settlement project has an environmental, cultural, and economic faces to it. But basically, to understand what the political is, one should try to look at how bodies of both animals and people are maintained and enhanced. So first of all, the talk really revolves around the story of a hormone research laboratory that operated in Jerusalem between 1934 and 1966. First part of the lecture, we'll talk about we'll discuss the early days of endocrinology, sex endocrinology specifically, which means the study of sex hormones and the management of reproduction in Europe and the United States in the 1920s and 30s. The second part, we'll talk about the multi-species settlement project in Palestine and how infertility became a main threat to that project. The third part of the lecture deals with how the laboratory came to serve the settlement by dealing with this problem of infertility. And then lastly, the talk will focus on how the needs of the settlement came to then shape what scientific work was. So our story today begins with an end, with a collapse of a scientific career, with exclusion from a vibrant scientific community, and with exile. It's also a story of beginning, of immigration, resettlement, and rehabilitation of academic value. That then became entwined with displacement of a different scale in the decades to come, namely the displacement of more than 700,000 Palestinian people. In the process of these dramatic events, I'd like to argue both science and the land were shaped anew. At the core of the process was a decision of one of Europe's most prominent gynecologists and sex endocrinologists, the German Bernhard Zondek, to immigrate to Palestine in 1934. This happened after he already contributed immensely to the expanding hormone pharma business in Europe and the United States, and was highly admired for his discoveries. Zondek's research in Europe was part of what historians have called the golden age of the reproductive sciences, peaking in the 20s, 30s. In this period, scientists described the endocrinal system, discovered various biological sources from which to purify hormones, and attempted to map the reproductive system of various creatures. Zondek is especially known for identifying the pituitary gland. This is here, as a center of the hormonal activity. He called it the motor of the sexual function, and he posited, and I quote, the gonadotropic hormone is a superordinated general sex hormone under whose influence the gonadal hormone of the ovaries and testes are produced. So he identified two such gonadotropic hormones, calling them prolan A and prolan B. Zondek was also responsible for promoting urine as a substance rich of sex hormones, particularly after he found traces of what he was known then as female sex hormones in the urine of pregnant women, the urine of pregnant mares, and even more so in stallions. At the core of his findings was a growing understanding that hormones can be found and purified from biological material, and also that hormones extracted from one creature can affect the hormonal activity in another. Zondek, in other words, was responsible for defining and promoting what we might call the hormonal body, a new way of understanding how living organisms function. The reliance on bodily material posed a great logistical and financial challenge. Zondek's discovery of sex hormones in urine of humans and equines was revolutionary, since urine was abundant because its availability nearly eliminated the need to search for hormones in where it was searched until that point, in slaughterhouses, a site where animal ovaries, testes, pituitary glands were obtained, or in gynecological wards, for human ovaries, for blood and placenta, or the morgue for human pituitary glands. So that was not needed anymore with urine. Zondek participated in the global standardization of sex hormone measures and was the co-developer of what is known as the first widely used pregnancy test, together with biochemist Salma Ashheim, and this is known as the Ashheim-Zondek test from 1926. This test, which you should really now learn to become familiar with because it will be a thread throughout the talk, is commonly remembered as the rabbit test or frog test, depending on what animals was used as a tool was the test in the laboratory. And this test became immensely successful, already used by many thousands of women in England, for example, in the 1930s. So the Ashheim-Zondek, or in short, AZ test, was based on tracking hormonal activity in the reproductive organs of creatures. I say creatures, I mean both women and animals. After they were injected with blood or urine of pregnant females. So let's see. If you inject an extract of a woman's urine into the body of a female mouse, as the example that you can see here, and a particular hormonal reaction is evident in its sexual organ in the form of bluish blackish points in its ovaries, as you can see on the right, then you can conclude that the woman is pregnant. A limerick written by one of Zondek's American colleagues to honor him for his birthday, 60th birthday, that was in 51, illustrate the significance of this invention and the way in which the test worked, but also the qualities of its imagined user. And so the limerick reads, when a virgin indulges in vice, to Zondek she runs for advice. He asks the young miss to examine her piss, since the blood points in mice are precise. So, according to this limerick, urine holds the secrets of immoral behavior, and Zondek has the power of revealing it. Let us now return to the multi-species nature of settler colonialism in Palestine. My book that was already mentioned examines the European settlement project in Palestine from the late 19th to the mid-20th century, roughly, and the efforts to create plenty through agricultural production and human and animal reproduction. I focus on the biblical metaphor, a land flowing with milk and honey, that was frequently used as a way of equating Palestine with the biblical land, with the ideas about the Holy Land. And I analyzed the extent to which this metaphor was given a literal interpretation. So I look at Christian and Jewish settlers in Palestine and the changing governing regime. So I'm looking through late Ottoman, British rule and early Israeli rule, and how they utilized a variety of tools and techniques to demonstrate that Palestine could literally flow with milk and honey. So these various, what I call technologies of plenty, centered on agricultural production and on honey and milk producing animals. So this book is about bees, water buffaloes, goats, sheep, cows, and also people. Ultimately, the book shows how the settlement project was a biotic one, and that as part of a new environmental regime, European creatures replaced indigenous local ones. So just to say briefly, cows and white goats came to replace water buffaloes and black goats. European settlers came to replace indigenous peoples, Palestinians. This same work is also became the basis of the exhibition at the Israeli Pavilion in the Architecture Biennale that was presented in 2021. And these are some of images from that exhibition. Settlers' dairy cows that were the, oh, sorry, I think I missed, yeah, I missed this. Okay, settlement was not only about people. Cows and milk production became very central to the agricultural economy. The focus on improving the milk yield and increasing the dairy cow population was consistent from the early years of European settlement in Palestine, much earlier, for example, than the Dutch dairy culture that was actually the model for what was happening in Palestine among settlers. Along with attempts to prove abundance, plenty, settlers' way of valuing animal differed from European ways, with an overall focus on quantity rather than quality. As opposed to the British, Dutch, German, also the Swiss traditions, cows were mainly judged by their yield, not their external features. So for the time, that was exceptional. In spite of the growing success of the new crossbreed of local cows and European bulls, which agriculturists gave it a name for this new breed, calling it the Hebrew cow. Anxieties emerged in the late 1920s as various farms reported on infertility problems among third and fourth generations of the crossbreeds. Settlers' dairy cows that were a product of calculated process of breeding European with local cows suffered from infertility and high percentage of miscarriages, a phenomenon that settler farmers considered to be a sign of degeneration. Cow breeders noted that the Middle Eastern environment, together with the heat and efforts to produce a lot of milk, had a negative effect on those high quality crossbreeds. Since annual pregnancies were crucial in order for cows to continue producing milk, this issue received a lot of attention by both Jewish settlers and the British colonial authorities. The Cattle Breeders Association noted that, and I quote, "It is well known how hard infertility disease strikes in the last years in many of the herds. We don't know what explains this stubborn infertility." So this is one of the early publications having to do with sterility or infertility of cows. Research centers attempted to find solutions to this problem that threatened to limit milk production capacity, but also the survival and growth of the salmon population as a whole. The problem of infertility was not limited to farm animals. During the same period, the medical community, so human medical community, together with experts such as statistician named Roberto Becchi, who was employed by the Zionist organization to decipher Palestine demographically, and then established the Israeli Center for Demography. In this same period, Becchi lamented, again, I quote, at the disgraceful situation of reproduction rates of the Jewish population in Palestine. So infertility was defined, kind of articulated as a problem to the settlement project across species. Now let's go back to Zondek. In 1933, Bernhard Zondek, like many other Jewish professionals in Germany, was forced to leave his positions at the Charité Hospital and the Municipal Hospital Berlin-Spandau with the rise of the Nazi rule because he was Jewish. He was invited to Jerusalem in 1934 to head the gynecology ward at the Hadassah Hospital that was in the parallel department at the Hebrew University's medical school that was to open that year. With resettlement, Zondek quickly built regional reputation and was known as the gynecologist who treated the wealthiest and most honorable women of Jerusalem and the entire East, both Muslim, Jewish, Christian. When he moved to Jerusalem, and in spite of his expulsion from these esteemed positions, he expected to continue his lab work and to participate in the global scientific community. He wanted to establish a laboratory to continue his investigations with hormones at the University of Jerusalem. To his great disappointment, however, this plan encountered significant, mainly financial obstacle on the way to implementation. The university did supply few rooms in what he defined as an Arab house for the purpose of conducting these experiments, but not much beyond that. The house was small, he claimed, so much so that he was forced to house all the animals that were participating in his work, such as goats and chickens, on the roof, creating what he called a farmyard atmosphere, rather than an ambient of an advanced research laboratory who was used to from Berlin. Where still, both the university and the hospital refused to fund the work at the lab or purchase any equipment, created a situation where he had to bear most of the financial burden himself. It took almost 6 years for the university to finally agree to include this lab within the medical school at the university. And in the meantime, Zondek won numerous international prizes, was repeatedly nominated for a Nobel Prize, if I'm not mistaken, 8 times, didn't get it. Finally received a modest budget in Jerusalem to purchase some equipment and could finally hire an assistant. That assistant, we saw his picture earlier, but now we get to know him. Dr. Felix Zumann, also a German immigrant, started working with him already earlier, but finally was able to find financial tranquility. Zumann trained as both a human doctor and a medical doctor. Human doctor and animal doctor, was particularly suited for this lab because his qualifications facilitated the daily work needed with both women, chicken, goats, mice, rats, and mares. Zumann fit the lab also for local reasons. He was kind of used as the interpreter of Zondek. Zondek wasn't very good. His Hebrew wasn't very good. So very literally, he was translating Zondek's findings to the Palestinian context. Already in the first years of working in the lab, Zondek and Zumann succeeded in keeping their studies and findings in step with the aspirations of the international scientific community and its universalistic logic of objectivity. This is demonstrated, for example, in publications in leading journals and academic presses, a lot of articles and books, which focused on biochemical investigations of hormones, what researchers have been doing in that period for a while. They studied, inspired to explain how hormones work in all organisms everywhere, right? This is the standard of scientific work. As the year passed, however, and while they continued to target the global hormonal community, both of them, Zondek and Zumann, became gradually interested in the needs of the settlement project. And As a result, their science changed. That's what we'll see at the end. They began dealing with others, neither organ-specific nor creature-specific, but questions that are site-specific. They focused on this problem of infertility and more generally tried to explain how fertility is related to this particular environment. Infertility, as we've seen, became a severe problem in the growing European, mainly Jewish agricultural economy already in the 1920s. The Jewish Veterinary Science Services learned about this new lab and the possibility of having hormone treatments. This was a kind of a new arrival to Palestine, a great discovery, and decided to consult with Sondeck in an attempt to deal with that bovine infertility that worried them so much. Sondeck and Zuhlmann were involved in settlers' animal farming community in various ways. So one example for this is in the 1940s annual meeting of the Jewish Veterinary Services, where Sondeck and Zuhlmann lectured on the female reproductive system and introduced the possibility of using hormone therapy in cattle and other farm animals. What we see here in this image is Sondeck preparing for this lecture. And the reason I know this is you can see the cover of that lecture I found in several different archives. So it's a gynecologist really coming to give a lecture to farmers about what they can do when their animals don't get pregnant. What they said is that they argued that farmers can, instead of purchasing imported fertility drugs that actually were not really available anyway in times of war, they proposed searching, and instead of searching in slaughterhouses and the hospitals, they proposed this idea that Sondeck already knew from the 1920s, and that they could collect urine of pregnant mares or women and then using it for their cows or their sheep. So beyond catering to the needs of the professional animal farming community, Sondeck and Zuhlmann established connections and collaboration with particular farmers that were part of this same settler colonial project. One of the Zuhlmanns, for example, closest collaboration with this particular sheep farmer and shepherd called Aaron Harari, and he was living in a settlement called Kibbutz Merchavia in the north of Palestine. Infertility problems limited milk production among the sheep, his sheep, and threatened the existence of the whole herd. If there's no production of milk, but if there's no reproduction of sheep, there's no herd, there's no future. These infertility problems threaten this herd, but also in other agricultural settlements. Then Harari contacted Zuhlmann in the lab in Jerusalem after he learned about the possibility of hormonal treatments, and the two of them, Shepherd Harari, Dr. Zuhlmann, worked together to solve fertility problems among the sheep. Based on Sondeck's early discovery of sex hormones in the urine of horses and women, and the possibility of increasing the chances of impregnation with the injection of sex hormones, Harari and Zuhlmann combined forces in order to detect pregnancies in Jewish farm. So you need pregnancy in order to take urine in order to solve pregnancy problem or pregnancy problems in other animals or people. The search worked as follows. Harari would visit different agricultural settlements where horses were raised. He would then take samples of blood or urine, send those to Jerusalem. He was using either taxis or the bus. So you can see on the right here, this is a standardized taxi receipt I found where these samples would be sent to the laboratory. Then they would use the AZ test that you know pretty well, and then realize, they injected it to the mouse or rat, examined the ovaries, opened it up, checked the ovaries, and then determined whether that horse was pregnant or not. Then Zuhlmann would send a letter to the farm or a telegraph to Harari, noting positive if there's pregnancy, meaning the horse could be then used for treatment, or negative for non-pregnancy. So in the spring of '46, for example, Zuhlmann writes to Harari about a particular horse whose name was Ruti, this is on the left here, whose urine showed positive results. After a four-day examination, traces of proline A, so remember one of the gonadotropin hormones, was discovered in Ruti the mare. So she's pregnant. Mare Tzvia, different name, remained negative, unfortunately. So finding cases where that mare was known to be pregnant, Harari would collect the urine or blood and inject a concentration of this urine to the sheep in order to encourage their impregnation. When pregnant horses were hard to find, Harari had another potentially easier option of finding pregnant women, asking for the urine and then similarly using it for his sheep. And now I quote, "For urine of women, you don't need a matchmaker. You have the chances of finding an easy solution. If you don't manage to get the blood or urine of mare, try to take the double amount of women's urine." He concluded, then you can inject the urine to any clean part of the sheep's body. Okay, are we all following the direction of urine? Yes. The search for pregnant horses turned out to be more difficult than expected, as horse owners did not always cooperate, and because the horses themselves did not always conceive easily. So there was also a problem of infertility there. In 1944, Zulman wrote to a member of an organization called the Organization of Draft Carrier and Riding Animals, complaining that, and I quote, "Nothing has changed since I wrote. I understand that your stablemen and are loafers of the first degree. I didn't receive blood, not from Mare Fatme and not from Mare Sonia." So what's the meaning here? He's referring to the kind of scale possibilities of finding horses, either in Jewish farms where the majority of the people are of East European origin, and Sonia is supposed to stand for that name, or Fatme, possibly a Palestinian name of a horse. So we couldn't find either pregnant horses in either of the different types of farm contexts. On the side of sheep farmers, however, cooperation was on the rise. Everyone wanted hormones to treat their animals. As a result of these connections with other farms, and by supplying all these treatments to his sheep, but also other sheep, Harari, the farmer, the shepherd, became his kind of a self-made professional. He became an expert in fertility treatments by his own right. So just as an example of how that worked, it created this whole network of sending hormones around. So this here is an example of shepherds from a different Jewish settlement called Kfar Sod, who informed Harari that the impregnation has really ceased completely among the herd, that is. And we ask you to, if you'd be willing to come over and inject some hormones to as you promised, to the sheep. So by so doing, Harari and many other settler farmers were able to increase the production of milk. As you remember, reproduction is tightly related to milk production, while engineering sheep pregnancies according to the time when milk was at greatest demand. The detective work at the lab and the manipulation of urine in particular played into the growing success of the settlement efforts. To increase reproduction, not only knowledge about but also materials moved between the farm and the lab and between the bodies of different settler creatures. Results from these collaborations became the basis of scientific publications. While not a qualified scientist, Harari reported to the local Jewish professional community of different experiments he conducted using mares and women's urine in an attempt to improve the fertility of the sheep. In addition to publications related to animal reproduction, Sondek, you might remember, is a gynecologist who has his own gynecological working in a gynecological ward, but also had a private clinic. He also published results from experimenting with hormone therapies in women. Okay, so for the scientists at the lab, the consequences of these farm lab clinic relations went further than just producing publications. Gradually, the requirements of the settlement project and its limitations shaped what sex endocrinology was doing. It redirected its flow. So settlement shaped science. And this is what we'll be focusing on now. Zondek and Zulman's studies and Zondek's clinical practice gradually focus on this problem of infertility, which to some degree contrasted the global trend of the post-World War II period. While the global scientific community turned from dealing with infertility and enhancement of reproduction, turned to family planning and the production of contraceptive with the attempt to control the reproduction rates in the global south. So there's kind of a reversal of the focus of that science. As opposed to that, the local fertility research community in Palestine and Israel continued to deal with fertility promotion and to find solutions to infertility. Infertility was considered a problem that was specific to settlers in Palestine and demanded intervention. In 1936, Zondek noted, and I quote again, "In Palestine, where sterility is particularly important, I've often found in sterile women a characteristic atrophy of the uterus, which is rarely seen in Europe." So he's talking about a local biological phenomenon. There's something different about this place. Moreover, in an interview that he held in the year of his death, 1966, he's asked whether during his long successful career, he ever dealt with preventing pregnancy, which, as I said, was the trend of the post-World War period. Zondek said, "Maybe I did some, but it was not intentional because most of my efforts have been on behalf of fertility rather than sterility." He means fertility promotion. This was especially true after 1934, that's Zondek saying, "When I moved to Jerusalem and realized that sterility in certain cultural and religious contexts was a very grave problem for women." So he was explaining basically here that this was the issue of infertility was a problem because of cultural and religious reasonings. But as we saw, the problem of sterility was not only about women and hence not only about cultural and religious reasoning, but tightly connected the farm to the clinic. So we could say this kind of expands what he meant by cultural and religious to include within that sheep and cows. Over the years, moreover, and the two of them, Zondek and Zulman in the lab, came to treat fertility differently in a manner that was attentive to a place rather than organ or a specific creature or organism. As part of their study of hormones and in spite of the global push for standardizing hormones, these scientists attempted to understand the connection between creatures that settle and a particular environment. Their studies reveal that they were increasingly interested in analyzing the effects of immigration on the body, and in a different sense, on the consequences of Western or European American settlements in the lands of the East. Zondek, for example, began studying the hormonal potential of the natural environment. So now I'm going to kind of review some examples that show that they started dealing with this idea of how reproduction is related is affected by the environment, basically. And that's how the sites change. So he in this case, examined the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee as potential sites for the extraction of sex hormones. Using the same AZ test, he injected a concentrated amount of water from these seas to mice, and then he examined the influence of that on the reproductive organs. And he was happy to discover that there are gonadotropins in the Dead Sea. The deeper the water, the more hormones. He then published the first results in Nature, the most important scientific journal of all times. He also submitted several research proposals to the Board of Scientific and Industrial Research of the British colonial government in Palestine to study the connection between fertility and Palestinian environment. So these examples show that also the British government was invested in similar questions. In one of such proposal that was titled "The Study of Occurrence of Sex Hormones in Palestinian Plants," he introduced the possibility of feeding sterile animals with plants that are rich with sex hormones and then combating sterility in animals, which he called often encountered in tropical and subtropical countries. Writing in 1959, this is over a decade after the State of Israel was established, he commented and now I quote, "The function of the sex glands and their relationship to fertility and sterility depend not only on the endocrinal system, but also on environmental factors. In Israel, where immigration from many countries is so prevalent, we often notice amenorrhea of several months duration in young girls unaccustomed to the subtropical climate of the Israeli coast." So he brings up all these examples of how environment affects reproduction. Zulman similarly conducted experiments on the relation between the environment and sterility. He used the ties established with Harari in Kibbutz Merchavia, for example, to collect data about animal fertility, but also to obtain samples of local plants. And then he conducted experiments testing their hormonal potential. One of these plants that made him particularly curious was the mandrake. This was a local wild plant that has long been known to treat infertility and commonly known as an aphrodisiac. The mandrake won great attention across folk traditions due to its magical qualities, but also because its root resembled the human body. And according to Palestinian cosmology, the plant it was considered, didn't just resemble a small human, it was actually considered to be a small person. Zulman was interested in examining whether this fame meant that the plant contained sex hormones. He asked Harari to collect samples for him and then send it by the bus again, and finally was able to trace sex hormones in this plant. And this is the publication on the right indicating that there are in fact hormones in the mandrake. Zulman also attempted to find sex hormones in local hashish, but unfortunately he found none. Also in same settlement, Merchavia, the two of them conducted experiments on the relation between light and fertility, and in another study on the effect of controlled secretion of sex and other types of hormones on lactations of both cows, sheep, and women. One of the main research fields that Zulman led in the post-World War II era, which he continued after leaving the lab, was bioclimatology or biomateriology, the study of the relation between climate and body health. Zulman was a member of the Meteorological Research Council formed by the British government and carried a committee called the Climatic Effect on Domestic Animals. So you see all these examples that are a bit long, they kind of demonstrate how these changes in their perception of what is the problem became really institutionalized and really penetrated the way they were doing their science. As was the case among cow breeders, the local climate bothered hormone researchers, farmers tremendously. The Middle Eastern heat was considered to have a negative effect on the health of the body and its fertility. In his later years, Sondek has developed another research project, which similarly demonstrated his interest in the effect of the environment on reproduction. He began examining, sorry, I missed that one. This demonstrates Zulman's work on climate and health of people and their bodies. But now Sondek began examining the connection between sound and fertility. This path of research was promising, and he invested all his energies and conducted what he called pure sounds within a kind of sterile acoustic space. And what he attempted to do is to see how noise, which often Sondek and his colleague were talking about noise and how the Middle East is noisy and how that affects health and stress and mental abilities. So what he was doing to kind of test these ideas was to use the same AZ test. And he exposed these mice to this sound, opened them up and checked what happened to their ovaries. Finally now, after a few decades of doing this type of research, now as an acclaimed researcher and celebrated great doctor, the university did supply him with space speakers and mice. But unfortunately, soon after he traveled to New York to continue his investigation there, and he died unexpectedly before he finished. So we don't know what happens with noise and fertility. So the story shows what happens to science in the context of settlement and the ways in which the work of immigrant scientists served and became part of a biotic settler colonial project. It was in times when the global bioscientific community learned to ignore the environment and turn to search under the skin and within the cell, I would also say, that settler scientists decided to look around them. Despite the logic of objectivity and placelessness positioned at the basis of science, researchers in Palestine and Israel in the mid-20th century were going local. By studying hormones in connection to light, heat, noise, and natural resources, their study aligned with the properties of a new geopolitical regime. Hormone researchers gradually became interested in the relation between the problem of infertility and a particular kind of environment. In so doing, they tried to overcome an embarrassing realization. There was a great gap between their assumption about Eastern sexuality and the settler creature's sterile reality. Urine emerged as a savior substance. It contained the largest amount of sex hormones needed to manage infertility problems. And more importantly, it was endless. The salvaging power of urine grew even further when it was discovered that in postmenopausal women, so not pregnant horses or pregnant women, but postmenopausal women, that urine contains both types of sex hormones needed to induce ovulation. So both what Sondag called prolan A and prolan B, now called FSH and LH. So these ones together, treatment with these two types of sex hormones enabled first clinically induced pregnancies in the world, and that happened in Israel in 1961. So this is preceding IVF treatments. So pretty foundational to what reproduction technologies are, or how they developed. And this all happened in a new center for hormone research and manipulation of urine that was established not far from Jerusalem. In the early 60s, the endocrinology laboratory at a different hospital, the Tel HaShomer Medical Center, used urine of postmenopausal women. So that urine was collected from both Italian nuns and Israeli women living in elderly homes to produce, in cooperation with the pharmaceutical industry in Italy and an Israeli one, and the support of the Israeli Prime Minister office directly, as well as the Vatican, a revolutionary drug to treat infertility. That drug is called colonial and is still in use. So the same process of collecting urine still happens. This drug became the stepping stone in development of assisted reproductive technologies. Okay, this is a promotional film, that was produced by the pharmaceutical company as part of, it's layered by a later pharmaceutical company's promotional farm, but basically these are images from the first collection campaigns of urine. Through the lab in Jerusalem, urine connected the farm to the lab and to the clinic and flowed between the bodies of different settler creatures. In the years to come, urine also crossed the Mediterranean Sea, that is, Italy, connecting the Israeli Prime Minister's office to the Vatican, elderly women in Israel to the pharmaceutical industry in Europe, and Italian nuns to primperous cows, gradually blurring the contours and limitations of the corporeal. Finally, if you ask a human reproduction expert today, what they might say is that, or they would say that fertility is not affected by the environment, that women, it's not only about women, of course, but women around the world suffer from the same percentage of infertility problems no matter where, approximately 10.5%. But if we turn our eyes towards the farm, then environmental explanations are continuously very prevalent. So these are some examples of scientific publications that deal with cows, showing how much heat, for example, is super basic to managing fertility questions, or very important, has been throughout this period. There was no stop. This is as opposed to what was happening with humans. Israeli cows are today, or at least until a couple years ago, were known to be the best milk producers in the world. Israeli women are known as the best consumers of fertility treatments in the world. This talk is, in a sense, an attempt to historicize this set of phenomenon. What is less known is that Israeli cows are also the best fertility treatments consumers in the world. What I tried to say by this is that this historical case studies shows that the divergence in the scientific explanations between the human and the animal phenomenon are historically contingent, that they're a product of our time and social norms. Only a few decades ago, in a particular environment, particular cultural and particular political context, the assumptions that underlie scientific work looked completely different. The stories that I outlined demonstrate the ways in which scientific work is entangled with political projects. Ultimately, the story of Ruti the horse, as well as that of the horse named Fatme that was nowhere to be found, they tell us something about how political processes get to be narrated and demonstrate how social norms and needs shape scientific work just as much as they shape territories. Thank you. So just a brief moment to rewire ourselves, and I would ask you perhaps, Nitin, to show us the hybrid audience on the big screen. Thank you so much, Tamar. I have to say, it feels a little bit like I was thinking, like, what do I feel like while listening to your lecture? And I think like perhaps watching a kind of Lars von Trier film, you know, like a Dogma, like kind of extreme discipline and dryness and the kind of realism of certain portrayal, which I think is also in that sense it's very effective. And I would like to perhaps try to make you know, to make a bridge to the bigger picture of this series, you know, of the sessions on territory before we go into the kind of a conversation with Hollyamber and Will. So of course that it is clear that in let's say the kind of under global agricultural regimes, the intensification process, the so-called intensification is a crucial operation in which agricultural territories and economies are managed, you know, in Switzerland, for example. So we, I mean, we could be quite, I would say, confident that a contemporary case study, let's say, in a kind of a Swiss dairy farming would yield let's say, a pretty similar narrative of a kind of extreme intervention in the you know, reproduction process, perhaps even more extreme than what we have seen as the tools have evolved. So I am curious to ask you in this sense about the question of the reproductive technologies and how do you enter the kind of critical debate around the sort of ethics of these technologies, you know, between the 1930s and the 60s and all the way to the present. I mean, we were having two sessions previously with Raj Patel and Debjani, who is with us in the audience, and also last time with Lenora Ditzler in Office for Living Things. And I can
I have to say I'm also surprised. So this is the kind of continuation of my observation of the talk, that I would have expected that we will talk more about, for instance, property systems, agriculture and property, for example. But we are really discussing technology and reproduction session after session, right? We have discussed with Raj Patel the problem of these, let's say, basically the gut bacteria that is being sort of bought and sold around the world as a form of medication. So it has to do with the sort of gut health, which is another type of, let's say, horizon. And with Lenora Ditzler, we have discussed this sort of robotics in pixel farming. So this kind of, how do you manage, the diversity or the difference, somewhere, between, to say so, kind of monocultural reproduction and the kind of diversity. So it is clear that some types of frontiers, let's say, of extraction that we are talking about are linked to the bodily processes, right? And the technology is acting directly upon the body, right? So in a way, property is less of our problem at this stage. The problem is to say so on a really kind of almost genetic and a cellular level, right? So I just did this sort of broadly for the audience to bring us all on the same page, or the people who have joined the previous sessions. Maybe just let's start there, like maybe it would be great to hear about your motives, right? So you're doing this research for many years. How do you see it relating to let's say, our possible politics and possible course of action in this field, right? What should our politics be?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, this is a gigantic question. I'd say, first of all, I'm kind of, I get way out of answering it because I'm a historian. I'm allowed to not talk about the present or the future.
Yes.
But of course, the way I'm asking historical questions is defined by what interests me, or what I think, the way I try to understand reality. Maybe one thing to start answering your many amazing, great questions is about this question of intensification that you started with. Really, for a historian, this is really not intensification per se, but just this question about difference is really key, because, well, we say these are processes happening everywhere, but then each of us depends on how you do your historical work, but its historical context is different, and we are actually define our work by saying why we need to justify why the context that we're studying or the topic that we study is different. So if you say the same happened everywhere, and still there are these particularities, and we try to pay attention to the local and to contingencies, then this is already a problem. I might start by saying that I don't think, well, there's all this overall gradual process towards similar ends. Yes, there's intensification, but I would say it wasn't the same everywhere. In this it might look very similar today, still not the same. But in this, I can say in the specific period I'm studying, and this is part of what I was trying to say, this efforts to intensify reproduction and intensifying production is this like motivation across context, but the way to do it through implementing technologies of reproduction was not shared in all contexts. I can give examples also to talk about. So presumably in this narrative of intensification, every technology that produces more is always better and always desired, but in fact, it's not the case. So there are a lot of examples I know from my context, and this is something I'm interested to develop further, actually, perhaps in this conversation, is that many technologies having to do with intensification were rejected or held for a long time until there came the time when they were right. Just a small example, milking technology. So how you'd use a machine to milk. This arrived in the context of the European settlement in Palestine in the 1940s, earlier than, well, I'm not quite sure. I don't know what to say about this area of the world exactly, but there was like a trial period, and then, so this was definitely have to do with intensification of production, right? And related to issues of reproduction. But these were rejected. They were thrown away, physically discarded, because of a whole package of reasoning of why this affects milking, affects the way the animal and the person milking are connected, and what that makes of the product. So these were for almost 2 decades were not used until they were then. So ultimately, yeah, everyone now, the majority of cows are being milked by machines. So the end is similar, but it's not. It's not necessarily getting there is not necessarily the same. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's true, and I think it's and you're right. Of course, the let's say the kind of specific moments are crucial, and also we have learned from our own sort of investigations of let's say farming approaches in Switzerland that there exist simultaneously very different narratives, right? In the same space, in the same canton, you know, narratives are in fact competing, and that's what makes agriculture so interesting, because in a way there seems to be that we are in this, you know, in the field where essentially the I think the ethical debate is open, right? What are animal rights? What are plant rights? How do we go about it? And I think we can return to it later on. I would invite the guests. Perhaps it struck me also, Hollyamber and Will, that in different ways your work also engage with the reproduction, perhaps in a
Can I jump in then?
Yes, please.
So I thought that I would open up with a maybe rather broad question about land and territory, to then circle back to the sessions on territory, and maybe specifically about the frontier conditions of settler colonialism. So in my class this semester, we've been talking a lot about the spatial and temporal distinctions between different forms of imperialism and on-the-ground colonialism, or imperialisms and colonialisms, not only in the modern era, but across human time. And to those forms of intervention, we can, of course, add the long timescale of extractive racial capitalism. So we can understand these forms of human intervention as signaling related but distinct historical spatial paradigms or analytics. So some with weaker and some with stronger links to land and territory. And among these analytics, as Lorenzo Verancini and Patrick Wolf tell us, the logic of elimination is a primary motivation and an organizing feature or a principle of settler colonialism. Right, so this superseded occurrence distinguishes it from other forms of colonialism, such as chattel slavery in the US model, or the franchise colonialism of the British Indian model, for example. So whereas these latter forms were specifically dependent upon as a first principle native labor, settler colonialism is at its essence a territorial project, right? Where the objective is the replacement of indigenous or pre-colonial inhabitants on their land, rather than the extraction of an economic surplus via coerced or displaced labor or dispossessed labor even in relation to that land. So within this paradigm or analytic, land is the basic precondition, right? And all the structures that define settler colonialism, which we can see in your work, in general are reflective of land's centrality, sometimes overlooked centrality, a strange kind of paradox. And your work, I think, offers us an enhanced way of understanding that analytic, right, which is through the development of a scientized agrarianism, more specifically through the study of the reproductive capacities of this biotic land, animal, climate, these ecologies, these biotic ecologies. So these animal stories draw attention to the structural complexity of settler colonialism and settler colonial territory, and the mediums, languages, and technologies, and the bodies of expertise through which these projects of territory have been crafted. And my question is, how you think, I mean, if we're talking about these differences and distinctions, how you think as a historian and as a historian of science about this frontier condition as a resource for science, you know, and in these feedback loops that you trace. And maybe further, how this logic of elimination and dispossession, which structures the landscapes of settler colonialism as this superseded condition, right, as this first organizing principle, the thing that distinguishes it from other forms of imperialism or colonialism, how you conceptualize, or if you do, that first role of dispossession in the story of reproduction. You know, we have been speaking, the three of us, about, you know, manufactured dislocations or the manufactured desolateness. Mm-hmm. So where that history of dispossession fits into the history of the science of reproduction and how that relates to the project of land and territory in settler colonialism.
Right. So firstly, if I understand the question about frontier for science, if I understand it correctly, this definitely was playing a part, not just from science. I mean, just going to the Dead Sea to look for hormones and then publishing it, this in Science. This is, if I get what you're asking, this is exactly this. So he was trying to, let's say, capitalize professionally on being in the outskirts or in kind of unexplored territory, and with his discoveries make his gain fame. In that time, the search for hormones, everyone was trying to, scientists around the world were trying to search around for looking around them, so for example, another known story is about the contraceptive pill coming from Mexican yams. This is also as a result of kind of cashing out on both actually indigenous Mexican knowledge of how you can find these yams and then how you can transform it into a pharmaceutical company product that then was used to control reproduction elsewhere. So these kind of knowing these the land or its that environment was definitely part of how this work was articulated. So, but it didn't help Sondic very much. I mean, specifically, as I was trying, a lot of the documents I have from the archive is him, as I tried to kind of start with the story, him trying to struggle to be funded. So actually from moving, he was, well, kicked out because he was Jewish, but also just moving to the Middle East had like really dramatic effect on what he was able to do. So he, for example, he was previously funded by the Rockefeller Foundation that was funding fertility research then, and they didn't want to fund him anymore when he was in Palestine, just because he was outside of their regular checks for, this is going a bit away from what you were asking, but just to say he was not being funded anymore, but by kind of funding bodies, central funding bodies, because he was in the frontier. So it didn't only help him. On the other hand, this was an exciting biological material to be dealt with. So there was something there. It's not, I wouldn't say it's like one directional. In many ways, him and the people he was working with were also trying to make do. Not much funds. They didn't have access to the pharmaceutical companies that were already strengthening, so they had to find ways. They just collected urine. They didn't. I mean, urine is still being collected, but the way it was done is also a result of their circumstances that were actually pretty limited. So the process is a bit more layered. Is the way I see it. Maybe the question of the second question of this position and the manufacturing of desert land, maybe we can develop this further as a discussion among us.
Hi, so well, please forgive my opportunism, but I wanted to talk about something that does relate to this manufactured, desolate landscape. But I'm really interested in your presentation about these aspects of folklore and the land. And in general, I'm really interested in that anyway, in my work. But the sort of science of folklore is really what I'm interested in asking. Or the folklore of science, I'm not sure which way around, because we've just watched to try to think about these things in tandem, the Inga community in the Amazon, and the Amazon is as a kind of a site of traditional medicine, but also monocrop plantations and mass scientific sort of management projects of the Western science is usually seen as being at odds with that. So Western science is often depicted as being totally at odds with folklore and spirituality and in general relationship to the land. But in your presentation, the opposite is at play, absolute polar opposite, that we have spirituality and the kind of larger land of milk and honey, that's coming in service of science. Actually, that helps his project, Zondag Salman Harari's project of even getting funded. So I think that raises some interesting problems for us as historians and trying to think through how do we have a vocabulary for that? When actually spirituality can come in all of these different shapes and forms and they don't fit the same logics in every place. I like how you opened with this discussion of difference as well. I think that's, so really it's a question of how do we have a vocabulary for this?
Can I just add too? I mean, I remarked to Will, I thought it was amazing, this image of the text from 1932 on the mandrake.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I mean, so this is Zondag's time, and you have this amazing study, the study of the history, right, of the folklore of plants in Palestine. Yeah. And so I think it also then raises that question of how Zondag himself is maybe mobilizing that, those other non-scientific epistemologies. Yeah, and then possibly other scientists outside of these realms. So that was my question about how far does this frontier resource extend?
Yeah, okay. So this question about folklore can go, I mean, interestingly, it goes both ways. Both ways if we're talking about two types of populations meeting on this land. What I mean, so definitely like the whole the whole project is framed around demonstrating how technology and science became a tool to materialize religious ideas, but also how, as you saw, then these ideas come to serve or shape what that science and what technologies are being produced and adopted. So in that sense, it's totally intertwined, and this like separation, this easy separation between let's call it indigenous or religious knowledge or spiritual knowledge and what science is definitely collapsing. But also in other case studies that I've looked at, the question of how that same science is influenced by other types of knowledge or is influenced by, for example, Palestinian cosmologies. We saw it with the mandrake. This particular example of that illustration comes from a woman that was part of a family of Christian missionaries that came and settled in Palestine in the 1980s and was invested in actually beekeeping. This is a story that, well, you already know a little bit about. This family was both invested in demonstrating that Palestine can flow with milk and honey, but at the same time was wanting to kind of collect everything they could know about this land and to make this happen. So they learned beekeeping from Palestinian beekeepers. They also, so this Baldensberger person was collecting information about knowledge having to do with plants, and altogether, so the frontier, I mean, they were definitely invested in, so to their understanding, they were doing preservation of knowledge, work of preservation of knowledge, but also utilizing this to demonstrate something that had to do with their own cosmology or their own definitely spiritual idea. This family also was practicing religious family, as opposed to many other settlers who actually saw the Jewish settlers who saw themselves as complete secular. They would argue for it. They were like the opposite of the Orthodox Jew. They were socialists, but then they would fight against everything smelling religion. But at the same time, their project was deeply, deeply religious in the sense that they were attributing these exceptional qualities to this land. It was supposed to be exceptional. So in the way to demonstrate this exceptionality, also ideas about the mandrake work. If it, so it's kind of, it sounds, I mean, you started to say utilitarian, is that was the word you were using? What, my question? No. So, I mean, there were, again, going back to it, making it, and there were, evidence was used in, or different and at times possibly contrasting types of evidence we used if they worked for this cause of demonstrating plenty. Yeah, I think this is what I have to say about this question. But I wonder, I mean, if we can, if you'd like, I'm talking in comparative perspectives about other settlement projects, if this works for you in your context similarly or not, that would be also interesting to hear.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm pulling back to agriculture.
Yeah.
I'm looking at palm oil plantations and production in palm oils, and the reproduction that I was engaging there recently was the introduction of a weevil to increase pollination in a small bug to increase the pollination in Malaysian palm oil plantations. So it's a kind of a completely different kind of, but I was wondering if it's not intensity, if it might be efficiency that is driven heavily through this kind of products. And looking at palm oil plantations, I was thinking and kind of trying to relate it to what you described. And I was wondering about the idea of scale and in how far, because you are talking about very intimate processes, and there were jumps in scale, suddenly kind of enormous amounts of urine. And the relation in science, or specifically in your case, to scale and scalability, I think is very interesting, because it relates also to the settler colonial projects and how kind of science can be upscaled immediately in order to kind of serve certain purposes. So in relation to this agricultural production or reproduction in general, I think that was something that because you were hinting to the territory sometimes, but it's a very small process. So this somehow was very interesting for me. You find anything in Sondek's description on how he frames himself as a scientist related to these other processes, or or was he kind of in his self-contained
other processes that have to do with enhancement, efficiency, or reproduction, or
and the settler colonial project?
Yeah, I mean
direct relation.
So, I mean, the question of scale here, yeah, I mean, ultimately, I give parts of this talk to a group of scientists. I mean, this has to do with scale. Bear with me, it's a bit of a detour. But and then they said, how can you make any conclusions from telling a story of one person or maybe two? It's like, and your end equates to, this is like for an experiment. It's like nothing. What does so I mean, the story here is pretty small and the numbers are small, but if you put this along with so what was happening in the lab, and then the second lab that was happening in the taking place or in the 60s, and then also what was happening around cow management, altogether these different circumstances also having to do with what I'm able to find in the archives. It's kind of bits and pieces. Of course, this is the past. And to add to this, Sondek's archive is actually pretty much non-existent. So this is common, like traces here and there. It disappeared. There's a story about a second wife taking his paper somewhere unknown. But just to say, the question of scale, I mean, it starts with this little story. It's also a very particular period when these like movements of, you can actually trace these movements of urine, and how to say how much this affected the whole like kind of larger scale project is, it's a hard move to do, like moving from n=2 to n= whatever amounts of urine in the 2000s. I'm trying to, I think as far as how he was framing his work, he was definitely, I mean, he was an active in there's a tension there. On the one hand, he has to maintain his to remain a scientist and be valued for what he's doing. He cannot frame his work as being public service or a politician or define himself as a farmer. He has to explain what he's doing. And if you read in scientific terms, so for example, if you read a scientific publication, you want to understand that what this deals with is actually sending the urine of this Hortig, that horse, to the lab in Jerusalem, and how that all had to do with anything that has to do with so from the scientific publications and the way they are framing the work, you can't understand any of these connections on the immediate level. So there's a kind of a necessary distancing. On the other hand, he was absolutely invested, not only in these material and levels and also level of ideas, but also he was part of his travel to the US that I was mentioning. He was also traveling to Latin America, was to try to find more funds to support the Zionist movement or Zionist organizations. So he was kind of in his later in life, he was going as this moving around as just Jewish scientists from Palestine and then Israel, that trying to gain more funds for the project that needed all this international support or financial support. So he was not shying away completely, but there's, I would say, both yes and no. Like he couldn't define his actual work as being about what I try to say it is. I hope this helps. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. I think it is exactly that tension that is interesting, that there is this, that also for me relates to what you described before, how global science turned into a kind of a generic mode of description, while he was looking into the kind of very local geographic aspects of reproduction. And I think it's that.
Actually, we just consulted in the meantime, and there are questions in the chat, and I'm trying to do a timekeeping operation successfully for once, which is normally so. And I would like to say, if we first take questions from the chat, and then it would be great afterwards to turn to the audience, because I find it almost uncanny that in this conversation we are joined actually by the team of Indigenous Inga, whose project is precisely to counter and to offer perhaps a new, I would say a different kind of narrative around, well, let's say, obviously territory, as you spoke, but also about what is life and what is perhaps, I don't know if a word reproduction is at all on the table. And so in a way, the whole different sort of epistemological and ethical system. So it would be great to hear perhaps also your reflections afterwards. And we have also a group on agroecology and many others. So let's go first with the chat.
So I'm just going to read the question from the chat. It's from Fike Murray, and he says, "Thank you for the great presentation." His question is, how did Sondeck and other settler scientists deal with or explain what I assume was a difference in fertility rates between the indigenous populations and settler population? So.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. I mean, I alluded to this question about difference between different populations and their fertility. He wasn't, I would say, his group or the community of fertility researchers were not dealing with this very explicitly, but there wasn't an underlying current there saying that we're influenced by the science of their time. For example, eugenic ideas about how time makes different, but place makes different types of bodies, and different places make different or different reproduction rates, but also should or should not increase or produce more or less or control that. So I said that's completely in a completely confused way. Just to say, there was definitely a discussion, not among the fertility experts per se, but more generally about Arab sexuality and Arab reproduction, and this fear of growing reproduction rates among non-Jewish population. But this totally exists till today. This is what is called a demographic problem or threat within Israel. So this obsession with difference in fertility rates continuously exists. Actually, not only between the Jewish and say Palestinian or Arab population, but within Jewish population as well. So I could say I can answer this question more directly because this was discussed much more in the literature among people like this Roberto Becchi I was mentioning, the statistician and demographer. He works of this kind, mainly in the 1940s, were really dealing with not only the problems they were really concentrating on what's happening with the Jewish populations, and the more Jewish people were coming from North Africa and Middle Eastern environments and were higher reproduction rates, this posed also a problem. So there's all these comparative works between different types of Jewish people, but also between, I mean, everyone living in this territory, and what you can do in order to increase the reproduction rates of those considered to need to, or that are more, that there is aspiration to have more of namely European Jews of European descent, as well as this. I mean, and for me, it's also interesting how when some of this language of the discussion becomes like not legit to some extent, whenever you move to the farm, there's no problem. There's no problem to discuss race, the category of race, when it has to do with animals, when it becomes obsolete elsewhere, or when it comes obsolete talking about people. There's no problem talking about how, I'll give you an example, for cows, the ideal for crossbreeding, that cow Stavita, you might have seen the one of the slide, this cow that was the ideal crossbreed between local, that is not a Syrian cow and a Dutch bull. So the ideal of mixing was until the late 1920s was that 2/3 local blood, 1/3 European, because it was thought that the local animal is hardy, it can manage the weather, but it's less productive. So you need a bit of productiveness or intensification of milk production coming in. So just 1/3, and 2/3 is more important to have an animal surviving, because the first European cows brought, they just pretty much, they wouldn't survive. So they started doing crossbreeding. So 2/3 local, 1/3 European. And then the political map, if you will, there were growing tension between the Palestinian indigenous Palestinian people and Jewish settlers rising in the late 1920s. Suddenly, in the same moment when the political map became one of depicted as conflict, then this ideal of crossbreeding shifted. Suddenly, the ideal became 1/3 local, 2/3 European. So this example is supposed to show that, I mean, again, there's an undercurrent about what is good, what population is supposed to procreate and which part of the population isn't. And then again, there's all this fear about why these European bodies are not able to thrive. It's a real problem, not just in, I mean, it's a question to tropical medicine across colonial contexts. Only that here it's a bit later. Yeah.
Yeah, please. Yes, there is
Sorry,
thanks.
just quickly, I mean, I don't know if you're, as you're canvassing for other questions, I mean, and I think to return to Will's question and the role of the mandrake, I mean, I'm also curious, and maybe as Hans asked, but in a different perspective, you know, how is Zondek conceptualizing himself, or is he articulating these other knowledges or practices that are, you know, seen in this other context as an existential threat to the settler population? I mean, is there within the scientific discourse, are there distinctions drawn between these other forms of, or other epistemologies of fertility?
Do you mean if he's concerned with Palestinian ideas about fertility?
Or if there are distinctions that are drawn in the mobilization of these other practices or understandings of, you know, pre-scientific, or not pre-scientific, but non-scientific understandings of fertility and infertility, and as that relates then to this crystallization of place-based knowledge that you are tracing through Zondek.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, in a lot of the other cases I studied, as an example, one example is shepherding, as like keeping sheep, and the idea of that settlement, Jewish settlers need to keep sheep and be shepherds to become like biblical leaders. In that case, so in cases like this, everything having to do with Palestinian cosmology, local practices, this is all very central and always articulated as part of what the process of becoming shepherds is supposed to be about. This is true for, so in all cases, this is becoming part of what is what professionalization means, what scientific or technological work means. In the case of, so I don't think, I just don't have enough data to say, but there were not, and this is also what I was trying to allude to with the case of the horse Fatma that wasn't to be found. He was not, in a way, not mentioning anything. So him and his community liked celebrating him as I said, gynecologists treating women in the entire Middle East. There was some Ethiopian princess that came to be treated by him in the 1930s, and this was very like it was a big part of how he saw himself as like, no, he doesn't care about all religions, all people. This is something he invested in, but he wasn't saying anything different in his work or in the few papers of personal papers of his I have. But ultimately, what he was doing was only serving a specific type of population. So I can't say anymore. I mean, I just, another example is, so I said Harari, the shepherd, was communicating with all these other shepherds and helping enhancing the fertility of all the sheep in the region. He was through his correspondence, all his contacts were Jewish farmers. There was one Palestinian farm he was writing something to, but it was kind of almost not. So there was just, this type of work was just part of creating kind of it was making, I mean, there's a whole historiographical question about separate economies in Palestine, yes or no. This is a whole different issue. But they were just actively, even if not addressing this directly, they were working against some people's favor, some animals' favor, or it was creating difference.
Are there questions in the audience? Anyone?
Anyways, I just stand. Thank you so much for the presentation. And listening to it, I couldn't help but think through what's happening with the entire bovine politics in India. It is, and like how some of these don't grow old in some ways, while they remain very specific. I had a separate question, and the way you trace the question of hormone is very interesting. And so hormones.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at what point does animal breeding return to the question of the hormone, which is deeply a biological thing, right? It is kind of centers in the body. When does hormone become something that the scientists are looking into? I don't know. I'm just very curious. When is hormone discovered? When it is considered, okay, this is how we understand endocrinology, sexuality, and all of that. And how is it that both the climactic theory and the deeply biologized notions are sitting together? Which makes me wonder is when you're saying, like when you were talking about the particular kind of science, I was thinking, what's exactly settler colonial about this science? And when I came to the Dead Sea slide, I was like, okay, this is exactly what's going on. And I think you were trying to point out to the kind of frontier nature of that particular kind of science. And I said, okay, this is what's happening. So I was wondering if you can help us understand how does the biological and the climatological sit together? Because there was a certain point that gets dissociated if you look at colonial science. But here it remains together at a very late stage. So I was kind of curious. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of parallels my own process of realizing what was happening. So they were pretty much obsessed with identifying hormones in a biochemical level and different. So just to answer the question of chronology, endocrinology is a science that usually considered to have started in the 19 teens or 1908 is often defined as the year when it all started. So these are in the first few decades, it was all about finding, as I was kind of mentioning briefly at the beginning, it was all about, so it was a theory, and a lot of scientists were trying to kind of both understand it, but also prove that there's this thing called hormones, and it's actually affecting all kinds of things, like not just sexuality and reproduction, but growth. What we know now hormones are related to. So scientists in a variety of disciplines were involved in trying to prove this theory and kind of show how it works. Sondag just is remembered as having this very significant contribution because he was really able to both identify how it works as far as sex endocrinology is concerned, but also offer kind of concrete solutions that made the pharmaceutical industry happen. So a lot of it really, I would say maybe all of it started from these fertility treatments, not just for pregnancy, but for menopause and so on. So there were really very much a lot of the scientists of his age and of his community interested in kind of showing that there is such thing as hormones and how much it can actually, I mean, their way to show that it's there was to show that it can be manipulated, and the manipulation had to do with finding a place to take it from and put it in other, so taking it from corpses and other animals and so on. This was practiced for a couple of decades. Then some problems with it emerged, but then the urine just became this like great thing. But this was never, as far as I understand, this was the more the theory of hormone was becoming kind of proved, it was never separated from what is environmental. I mean, we consider it maybe to be something separate, but both it's a period when what is environmental is not the immediate thought is not to separate it from what living organisms is, but also where hormones exist in the environment is in plants, or the case of the Dead Sea, the argument would be is that it's left over, so there's no life in the Dead Sea. It's a very salty, non-living thing, but there's all these leftovers of past lives. That's where the hormones are there. That was kind of the argument. So it's not detached, but certainly, so the yams in Mexico are all these, or other plants that have, or the mandrake, it's all these living organisms. They're just not animals or people. So it's not really, I can't say it's separate, but they were certainly starting to not, like altogether the science, as I understand it, was trying to gradually going to the molecular, submolecular level. But in this case, it was different. Yeah, I hope if someone else knows more about endocrinology here, I would be happy to hear. I'm a historian after all. Yeah.
I would perhaps ask if there is still another question in the audience. We are indeed over time, as we usually are. I'm terribly sorry. Perhaps, okay. Okay, this would be certainly our last question.
Hello. Thank you very much for the lecture. I was just wondering, you've been talking a lot about the fertility and infertility of women and of female animals. And I was just wondering, I don't know the proportions, I don't know the data, but I assume this is a problem encountered both in male and female living beings. So was there any look also on in the topic of male or men's infertility, like that would be associated also with this whole problem in fertility for animals, or also for women, and also the site specificity they've been mentioning before?
Excellent question. I mean, obviously, I could say that historically the focus on studying reproduction has been on the female or body. And you can say an example of that is that gynecology existed as a field decades before, I even forget how it's called, the field of studying the reproduction of males. Oncology? No. Yeah, sorry, I forgot that. So actually one of the people promoting the need for this growing field is one of Sondek's, the person working on the non-urine project. He established the International Organization for Male Fertility and Infertility or something along these lines. But basically the question, because women are the ones having pregnancies, I would assume there's a real like kind of a focus on thinking about reproduction as something that, or infertility is something that is on is mainly having to do with a female. But of course, it's not that there was no understanding that this takes two, but the focus on is mainly on solving this problem, as it is also continuously today, is that this happens in the female body. So fertility treatments are mainly ones happening. I mean, even if the problem is found to be in the male, most of the efforts would be. It's the female body is the locus of these technological interventions. But on the same. I'd say also, like this, as I said, I kind of said again something about Eastern sexuality and all this. The focus on sexual potency was on men. The Eastern male was the one who was kind of usually the one depicted as being very fertile and very, so I mean, to answer some of these questions here that I didn't necessarily have the way to answer, I think this question is kind of a way to start looking at these at how different cosmologies or ideas about fertility intervened in how this field developed. I hope I made myself clear that something about ideas about the highly reproductive male body in the East is somehow relating to how everything that I've told developed. But I have no further knowledge of this.
Great. I think it was definitely enough for today. What an exciting session, I would say. We started with the pluriversity, with the indigenous university of the Inga earlier today. We started with the vision of the territory as a living sentient, and then we sort of went into the kind of modern technoscience in the Israel-Palestine, and you know, came back to this framing of agriculture around the core question of fertility, no? And I think that perhaps I'm indeed surprised, or let's say kind of linking the perspectives on territory to the body and to the reproduction is I would say a theme that we will have to continue to debate in the coming sessions. So please come back, I think 2nd of May. Yes. For a session with Christopher Roth, who will be showing his film, a chapter on John Berger. I think a person who intersects with your work also, Tamar. So I promise a kind of interesting continuation. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for coming from Berlin. Thank you, Hollyamber. Thank you, Will. Thanks everyone in the audience, and I look forward to continue the discussion.